So yeah, thanks for this opportunity. It's really exciting to be able to present to so many people during this lockdown. It's been a bit of a crazy time, what with whole home nursery and juggling the challenges of closing and reopening the Electron Microscopy Centre, but it's all exciting. So I wanted to take this opportunity to tell you about some of the recent work that we've been doing, mostly in the last couple of years, but with some historical stuff to build on that. And I wanted to start by thanking the very large number of people that contributed to this work. So I hope you can see my pointer, yeah? So these guys in black, these are electron microscopists who are working in my group. The ones in blue are the very talented group that fabricate the structures that I'm going to be telling you about. And the ones in purple are the theorists who help us to understand what's going on. So I should say that the structure of this is going to be broken up into 4 or sort of 5 subsections. I'm going to start off with giving you a refresher of scanning transmission electron microscopy. Now, I noticed from the list that there are some real experts in electron microscopy in the audience, so they will have to just have a little sleep at the beginning of this talk. But again, from the point of view of bringing everyone up to speed, I know we're from a diverse range of backgrounds, and since scanning electron microscopy or scanning transmission electron microscopy is absolutely core to this talk, I really wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page. So we'll just spend 5–10 minutes at the beginning checking that we're all understanding what we're talking about in terms of scanning transmission electron microscopy. I then want to tell you about some work where we were looking at deformation microstructures in 2D crystals and in Van der Waals materials. So understanding what happens when you bend a structure and being able to predict that to be able to control their behavior. I then want to move on into the third section, talking about some work we've been doing on air-sensitive crystals. So these are ones that degrade in ambient conditions, and they can have some really exciting properties, but if we don't understand and control that degradation, then they're really hard to use in the various applications. And then finally, I wanted to tell you about some really recent work which should be coming out early next week in Nature Nano, and that is looking at lattice reconstruction in twisted transition metal Dichalcogenide bilayers. And that hopefully builds on well from the fantastic talk that we had from Frank and previously on from Cedric. So Frank talked a lot about twisted bilayers in graphene and hexagonal boron nitride, and those two together. So this builds on that and applies the sort of understanding to looking at reconstruction of twisted transition metal chalcogenide bilayers. Great, okay, so without further ado, this is a picture of a scanning transmission electron microscope, and the key part of this microscope is an electron gun which fires electrons either from the top of the microscope or from the bottom. In this geometry we can see the electron gun is at the top, and that fires electrons through a very thin specimen. So when we're saying very thin, it must be of the order of 100 nanometers, but ideally it should be very, very thin. And of course, graphene and two-dimensional materials are perfect because they are naturally very, very thin. So in the scanning mode, we have a very finely focused probe, and we can focus that electron beam down to a sub-angstrom diameter, and we can then scan it across the sample. And we build up the image pixel by pixel, so we get individual information at every pixel as it's scanned, the probe is scanned across that surface. Now, the imaging mode that is most like the transmission electron microscope is called bright field scanning, TEM. And the bright field imaging mode is very powerful, much like a TEM image where there's a vacuum or no specimen, it'll be a bright, and where there's a specimen, it appears dark. But the problem with bright field imaging in the TEM or the scanning TEM is that it suffers from something called contrast reversals. So when you're down at the atomic resolution, sometimes atoms will appear white and sometimes they will appear black, and that makes interpretation more challenging. So a really popular imaging mode in the scanning TEM is this one called high angle annular dark field, or sometimes just annular dark field. And that's really popular because it uses Rutherford scattering, and therefore we have a high intensity signal where we have scattering from an individual atomic center. So when we're looking at atomic resolution image, regions that appear bright will be the positions of the atoms. And even better than that, this technique has Z contrast sensitivity, so it's sensitive to the atomic number. And that means if we know the thickness, we can work out the atomic number of our material. from the intensity that we get in the annular dark field image. So for a monolayer specimen, for hexagonal boron nitride, you can tell which are the borons and which are the nitrogen atoms. Of course, we can combine all of these imaging modes with compositional information. In that annular dark field mode, we can use those bright field electrons going through an electron energy loss spectrometer. So these will give us the information about the energy that the electrons have lost, and therefore information about bonding, about oxidation state, about plasmonic resonances. And we can also collect the X-rays that have been emanated when the electrons interacted with the material. These X-rays are characteristic of the elements in the sample. So this is an example of a high-angle annular dark field image. I think this one is credit of Recep Zan and Quentin Ramas at the ChemiSTEM laboratory. And if I just pause it now, you can see the image is being built up pixel by pixel. You can see the scanning, there's been no correction or anything here. And we can see that these regions of bright intensity are the molybdenum columns, so they're high atomic number, and in between them we have these double sulfur positions. If we just finish that video, it'll scan through, and we see one of the problems of the scanning electron microscope is that the material interacts with the electron beam, and that can cause changes to the specimen. In this case, we often lose sulfur vacancies, and that loss of sulfur vacancies you can see happening here, creating a hole in the crystal, leaving an excess of molybdenum, and this excess of molybdenum forms this molybdenum grid, molybdenum chain here. And that's always something we need to be careful of in the electron microscope, that if we're changing the specimen, we're understanding how we're changing it. So the sort of images that you can get from these materials are just some examples from our electron microscope, the Titan. You can see here for this molybdenum disulfide nanosheet, we can just see the positions of the metal atoms, but some of them appear brighter, and that's where the molybdenum disulfide has been doped with tungsten. So there we can identify the positions of the tungsten atoms and see that this nanosheet is really fully alloyed. If we look then at more robust materials, this case is oxides, we can use both the X-ray imaging and the electron energy loss spectroscopy to be able to build up a compositional map of the positions of the atomic columns. If a material is a bit less robust, so that's typical of the sort of nanoparticles that we look at, then the elemental mapping resolution tends to be of the order of more like 1 nanometer rather than atomic resolution. And so a couple of examples of elemental mapping in different nanoparticle systems are shown up here. Okay, great. So this is the electron microscope that is in Manchester. As you can see, it's very easy to use. This is one of our smallest users. He's not very good. But as you can see here, he is working hard and able to use the functionality of this system, which is focused around being able to do in-situ microscopy. So we're fortunate to have just upgraded our atmosphere system that allows us to do experiments in gases, not just in the vacuum of the electron microscope. In the atmosphere, we can now control the humidity as well as do heating experiments, and we're using that to look at different catalysis systems as well as various 2D materials. We also have systems that allow us to do imaging in liquids, and we're using that both with the conventional commercial holders, silicon nitride based, like available from protochips and various other manufacturers, and we're also doing experiments using our graphene liquid cells. And I haven't got time to talk a lot about that in the time that we have for this talk, but I've got some slides which I'm happy to talk to people about at the end or offline. Okay, so I thought there might be some funders in the audience, so it's important to just look at how great TEMs are. So TEMs are able to control the electron wave with incredible precision, and an example of that would be like creating a surface the size of Europe to an accuracy of just a few centimeters. So if we compare the optical capability of a typical Titan, or indeed a Joel or a Neon, Neon's probably a bit better. Oh. Sorry, yeah, great. So we compare that to the Hubble Space Telescope. We can see that the optical performance of the Titan is actually better than the Hubble Space Telescope. And if we normalize that by the cost, we find that the value for money for electron microscopy is really fantastic compared to the Hubble Space Telescope. And hopefully we will all want to invest in wonderful electron microscopes for our labs. Okay, so that's the end of that introductory section. I've got a question, which is that thank you, Thomas, for your input. You've seen that joke before, but it's got worse. Thank you very much. Okay, so what is the spot size of that TEM? So best electron microscopes now will typically have a spot size of about 50 picometers is pretty much the resolution. It varies quite a lot depending on the accelerating voltage, but sub-angstrom spot size is perfectly achievable in most aberration-corrected instruments. Hopefully that answers the question. Okay, so moving on to the first bit of the science stuff. Okay, great. So now this is a scanning electron microscope image, and it's actually a video which Aidan Rooney took in our focused ion beam. And the focused ion beam has a micromanipulator system. So what we're looking at here is him using the micromanipulator to be able to try to simulate exfoliation of this piece of graphite here. And I'm going to pause it here because what I wanted to draw your attention to are these lines that we see on the surface of this exfoliated flake. And these lines are, have typical crystallographic orientation, so they're orientated with respect to the crystallography of the specimen. And you see them at orientations compared to each other of 30 degrees. But we'll see how they happen a bit later. And as we exfoliate this upper layer using the micromanipulator tip inside the SEM, you can see that underneath the exfoliated layer, they've actually created, if your video is good enough, we've got an extra one of these line defects that's propagating underneath that exfoliated sheet. Okay? Now, these types of features are ubiquitous, so everybody sees them who have done exfoliation of 2D crystals. And if you talk to the people who make devices, electrical devices from these crystals, they will tell you that you have to avoid them. We don't want to go too close to these types of structural defects, or the electronic behavior of your material will be degraded, will be reduced. Okay, so to understand this and lots of other types of deformation, I want to go back to some work that we did in collaboration with Steve Donnelly and Jonathan Hinks at the University of Huddersfield, using what is confusingly called the Miami microscope. It's not in Miami, it's in Huddersfield, which is rather disappointing when you send a student. You send them to the Miami microscope and they only have to drive half an hour into the Peak District. But this instrument is very special because it's able to both perform ion acceleration irradiation of the specimen while simultaneously imaging it in the transmission electron microscope. And so an example of an experiment we did with this microscope is shown here. So what we took was a single monolayer graphene sheet, and you get the typical diffraction pattern when it's unirradiated, and you can see that it's relatively pristine, although with some junk on the surface. And as you irradiate that with the ion column, you can see in the electron beam that you start to get streaking. Actually, you can irradiate it with an awful lot of ions before you start to get streaking. It's a relatively robust material, and this was part of an interest which was from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency in the US for using radiation-hard electronics. And what we saw was when you get to these relatively high electron dose and you start to see streaking of these individual diffraction spots, we then took the specimen out from the Miami microscope, took it half an hour in the other direction to the ChemiSTEM facility in the UK, and Quentin Ramas was able to sit with us over a few days and take hundreds and hundreds of images of 5- and 7-fold defects, which is how the graphene sheet is accommodating the damage due to ion irradiation. So the ion irradiation is effectively knocking carbon out of the monolayer. And so the monolayer has to shrink to be able to accommodate that loss of carbon, and you end up with these many defects, 5- and 7-membered rings. Okay. Okay, sorry if you're missing some audio. Sounds like maybe, is it all right for you, Peter? Yeah, okay, great. So, okay, so that's what we see when we look just at a monolayer crystal. What happens when we look at a slightly thicker, so few layer or many layer graphite? No, the helium implantation, we don't see helium implantation. You have to be much thicker to see implantation helium bubbles. You do see that in metals. But the question here was, do you see any helium implantation? We don't see anything at all in the monolayer. And even in these tens of nanometer thick samples, you don't see helium bubbles. You do see them when you do similar experiments on metal specimens, which are, again, thicker still. Okay, so we see these beautiful hexagonal defect structures when we perform the same experiment on a few layer graphene rather than monolayer graphene. And when you zoom in, you can see that what's happening at the interface between these zones, and these zones are demonstrated by the fact that you have this hexagonal pattern, which is the zone axis. So very similar to Kikuchi patterns, which many electron microscopists are familiar with. This is the center of the zone axis, and around this is where the material is off zone. So it's effectively forming a dome, with the domes joined together by these dislocation lines. So if we zoom in on one of these dislocation lines, we can see that it's a bit like having a small ripple in the sheet, and that ripple in the sheet has to overlap. So we did some simulations. This is my simulation, this is the student's simulation, but you get the general idea. The dislocation in a few layer or monolayer graphite is where you have a slight ripple, sorry, bilayer graphite. You have this slight ripple, and where these two ripples have to then overlap and interact. And you can see that in the HRTEM. Okay, so why is this happening? Well, let's look a little bit more detail at what the ion irradiation is doing to the specimen. So the ion irradiation implantation depth causes more shrinkage at a depth of about 15, 18 nanometers than it does at the surface and at the bottom of the specimen. And that is reflected in a difference in the shrinkage. So if you start off with a material that is a perfect slab, then the shrinkage due to the Gaussian implantation peak that you'd expect to see is demonstrated by this crystal here. And that might well be what would happen for an amorphous system. But of course here we know that the material is very crystalline, and so it doesn't want to just deform and create a huge amount of strain within the layers. And so we can watch a video of what the material does to try to accommodate this strain. These are dislocation lines. So the dislocation lines, and as the material becomes more irradiated, the dislocation lines move to be able to accommodate that strain. And actually here, what you'll see is when we just run the video a little bit later on. So if we run that video now, we can see the dislocation lines are actually emanating out from this line defect here, and that line defect is very similar to what we saw in the video at the beginning in the SEM system. So as we continue to irradiate the specimen, we can see those dislocation lines increase in density, demonstrating increased strain in the material as the shrinkage occurs more rapidly. Oh. Okay, and then to say that propagates, and then you get this sudden change, and this sudden change which is like a flexing of the crystal, and then as we wait a little bit longer we get a very pronounced line defect. Okay, so I know it's quite hard to follow videos, especially if you're looking on your phone. And I've produced a sort of I've produced a snapshots through the imaging. So we start with an unirradiated specimen which has this line defect in the original system. We then get rows and rows of dislocation lines, and then those dislocation lines agglomerate to produce this very, very prominent line defect. We also can see there are actually similar defects happening at 60 degrees, which are accommodating effectively. You can imagine it's shrinking in all directions. So we need line defects in all directions to accommodate that 2D shrinkage. And what's happening here is that in order to preserve the stacking of the system, which is the most stable state for these crystals, the dislocations reach a certain density and then want to line up. So we're lining up the dislocations into particular grain boundaries separated by regions of perfect stacking. Okay, and if you tilt the crystal, you can actually see that these types of crystal defects really are sitting out of the plane. So that's this line, but tilted to the side and at the edge of the crystal, so you can really see that it's a 3D feature within the specimen. Okay, are there any questions? As incident angle of ions is 30 degrees. This system, you can't change the angle between the incident electron beam and the ion irradiation direction, so it's always 30 degrees to the electron beam. You can vary the energy though, which will change the position of your implantation peak. So you can change the energy within a range of keV. I think we're using about 30 keV. We've experimented with helium or with argon or with krypton and with xenon, and we see the same structural changes. So it really is down to the mechanical changes in the specimen and not to a chemical interaction with the implantation material. Okay, so now I wanted to go back to having a look, bit more of a detailed atomic resolution look at what's going on in these kink bands.
Sarah?
So here, well, yes?
There's actually a few questions. I don't know if you want to take them now.
Yeah, sure. What were the questions?
So the one up here is there ever any helium ion implantation? How thick was the graphite specimen?
Okay, so I think that we never saw any helium implantation. I think I did answer that. So we did have a look. You do get helium implantation in thicker metal specimens, depending on the energy, but we never saw any gas implantation. And it's pretty easy to see because it creates these bubble pockets within the material, and those are very clearly observable. We also did EELS and EDS mapping, and we never got any chemical signals from the elements that we're using for the implantation. So yeah, we didn't see any evidence of implantation. We've done the angle of incidence. Can you use doped graphene? Not for the energies that we're using here. The energies of the incident ions are much, much too high. Again, that's why we don't see a lot of implantation. But I know that other groups have been able to do implantation of the graphene structures by using implantation energy of the order of EV, whereas here we're using energies of KeV. Yes, although I agree, implantation of argon is probably unlikely. Although, I don't know, maybe in thicker samples you might get bubbles. Can you see any questions I missed?
Yeah, so if you scroll up, there's, for thick graphite, is there heating effect during ion irradiation from Baoming Wang at MIT?
I'd say it's hard to tell about heating in a TEM. We never saw any evidence of heating, and generally in the TEM imaging mode, we're keeping the electron dose pretty low in order to try and remove any effects of electron beam induced changes. So we didn't see any evidence of heating. Graphite's also a very good conductor, so often it's the secondary electrons that are causing the local heating and build-up, if there are any, and they get taken away very quickly by the graphene. So we didn't see any heating. We don't believe that that's a significant effect. I think it will be really interesting to do the same experiments as a function of temperature, for example. That's entirely possible, and you might well see very different behavior. So I think that's a really good idea. But I think that the electron beam induced heating here was very, very small. Fantastic. Yes, great. I agree with Toma. Few EV. Wonderful. Okay, so having a look at these kink band defects that we can see in the optical image in A and the scanning electron microscope image in B. And to investigate these, we've used the focused ion beam to dig out trenches on either side and extract a cross-sectional lamella through each of these types of defects. So what we see when we do that is shown here. So C is low magnification, then we zoom in D, and again further over E. And what you see in D is a little bit like the schematics I showed you previously, whereby we've got regions of perfect crystal stacking separated by these line features. And when we zoom in on the line features, we can see that they're associated with perfect stacking on either side, and then this local curvature. And we can just compare on the right here this curvature that we see compared to what we'd often expect to see in something like a metal where we have an abrupt interface. So this boundary is kind of a delocalized boundary rather than being abrupt as it would look if we were considering in B. Okay. Now we've taken a really detailed look, and this is work in Aidan Rooney's PhD. He finished a year or so ago, and Aidan was looking at many of these different structures, so comparing graphite, hexagonal boron nitride, and different transition metal chalcogenides, which are shown here. And what he did was he very painstakingly measured the length of one lattice plane compared to the next lattice plane compared to the next lattice plane, because that can tell you what the change in stacking is between one layer and the next, or between one side of the crystal and the other. And what he found was that throughout these layers, there was a very consistent difference in the stacking. So, and that this difference in stacking, which is measured here, corresponds to a known slip distance within the crystal. So if you're taking one sheet of graphite and you're slipping it over the next, it doesn't want to slip by any arbitrary value. It wants to slip by a known distance, which translates your AB stacking to BA stacking, for example, or to ABC stacking. Okay. So that means that we've got these boundaries, and the boundaries are separating perfect atomic crystals on either side. And as a material scientist, that jumped out to us as being what we expect to see for a twin boundary. Okay, but when we normally think as material scientists of twin boundaries, we'd expect these to be abrupt. So I want to show you what I mean by that. If you Google what are twin boundaries, you will get lots and lots of beautiful pictures like this one from the material science textbook that's available at the University of Kiel. So this is an example of a twin boundary, which shows you in a sheet of metal. And what you can see here is these are the twin boundaries, and they're very abrupt, but you've got perfect crystal on either side. And this, lots of these types of websites describe twin boundaries as being when the crystals on either side of a boundary plane are mirror image of each other, but the boundary between them will be a single plane of atom with no region of disorder. As I say, that's perfectly correct in a sheet of metal. But we've already seen that that isn't true in our graphite, our Van der Waals crystals. Okay, that's interesting because if you look back to the material science textbooks often use graphite to illustrate this perfect twinning effect. And that's because the very early work was done in 1960s by Fries and Kelly, and they talked about twinning in crystals like graphite, and that's because you can see it macroscopically in the crystals. You can see these abrupt changes which look to be very sharp to your eye optically, but of course that's because you're not able to look down at the resolution of individual atoms. So we can, hopefully we've shown that we actually need to reconsider what's written in these textbooks, and there is not an abrupt boundary for graphite. We have a twin type boundary, but this is delocalized, and the delocalization is of the order of a few nanometers. Okay, so we didn't just see twins when we looked at deformed microstructures. Aidan looked at many, many hundreds of different bent crystals during his PhD, and he was able to produce a library of these different types of structures. And what he saw was when you bend one of these crystals to a small angle, then the crystal can accommodate this bend within its structure. So you maintain effectively perfect stacking, but just with a small amount of strain. And that's okay as long as you don't bend too far. It's also okay if you have a monolayer or maybe a bilayer specimen. So very thin crystals are very, very flexible, especially for graphite or hexagonal boron nitride. We know that the strains that graphene can accommodate are enormous. And so if you have a very thin crystal, that can flex and bend. If we have a slightly thicker crystal, we need to accommodate the strain associated with bending and preserve single crystal stacking because that's very favorable energetically. And to do that, we produce these twin boundaries. And really interestingly, when you start to bend thicker crystals to very large angles, we get this much more complicated pattern, and that's what's shown here. So as you can see here, we've got quite a complicated microstructure, and we can see twins, but we can also see these individual regions labeled in green. So I want to have a little bit more of an investigation of what's going on there. And this again is what Aidan did. He had a look at the regions which you can see here, and we can actually look at these curved regions of graphite and look at the length of them, and we know the orientation because we're either looking along a zigzag direction or an armchair direction. And we can therefore consider these to be like carbon nanotubes or boron nitride nanotubes. So these nanotubes will therefore have a chirality, and we can assign the known chirality as a function of the distance from this inner core. So we can call this like a nanotube-like bending region, where all of these regions are, they don't have maintained their stacking, but they have this expected nanotube-like curvature. And then as you get further away from this core of the bend, we again transition to these twin-type defects. So we're calling this the mixed type microstructure. So you can look at the energy of these different microstructures, and you can plot a phase diagram, and this, as I said, was done with the groups in Hong Kong Polytechnic University. So they've plotted out a phase diagram, and as you'd expect, when you have a thin flake, you get nanotube-like curvature. If you have a very small bend angle, you get strained bulk stacking. You get discrete twins for these angles around the twin angle, and you get this mixed mode curvature when you get to larger angles. Now, that is really important because we find that we get this critical thickness, and this critical thickness corresponds to the thickness with which it is very hard to get mechanical exfoliation and liquid phase exfoliation to work really well. And so we've got some follow-up work, which I can't talk about because it's not published yet. However, and we want to do a recording. However, that's really encouraging, and it seems to be giving us some really exciting insights into the efficiency of liquid phase and mechanical exfoliation, and how this depends on the ability of the crystal to form twins. Now, we can then do the same thing experimentally. We can see the same type of behavior as that theoretical phase diagram. So again, we said thin flakes will bend, very small angles the flakes will bend. In this intermediate region, so thicker flakes at small angles, we get this twinning microstructure, whereas in the large bend angles and slightly thicker flakes, we get these more complicated mixed microstructures. Okay, so we can see what's happening within these crystals, because we can have a look at the effects of the changes in microstructure on the optical behavior. So here we've got a Raman map in the zigzag, the displacement of slip along the armchair direction. So for a deformation feature along the zigzag direction, what we end up with, we can't maintain this perfect stacking in graphite all the way through. We end up with regions that are not ABA, but which contain AA stacking. Even though that's very unfavorable, the slip requires those within the system, and we can see that these regions of AA stacking will create changes in the Raman signal, and so we can use this to be able to distinguish between the armchair and zigzag type kink band defects. Okay, so that's the end of that little section. Can I take some questions on that? Okay, thank you very much. Peter has put some of the references from my talk. There might be some more that I can add in and circulate if people are interested. Maybe we can attach them to the recording in the comments.
Sure, I will send a follow-up email. So if I can just have the references, I will put them in the follow-up, where also there's a link to the feedback survey. Xe,
wonderful. Okay, so on the figure A, we see ripples. Okay, which slide was that? JS Lorette. Which figure A? One before.
One before.
This one? No. Which part? No, I'm sorry, I don't have any numbers on my slides.
I think it was the one where you showed the metal, the twins in the twinning in the from the literature. This one, if I remember correctly.
This one?
No. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to go slowly and you're going to tell me to stop.
You could please unmute your microphone. No. Okay.
Okay, sorry.
No
yes, this one. Yes, this one.
Here, yes.
This one. We have some few ripples here, for instance, on the left. Not on the bending one, but just on the left here. I was just wondering if this is real, you know?
This bit here?
Yes, we see some ripples, you see? And,
yeah, I think it's probably scan distortion. I'm not sure without going back and checking, but I would expect it's probably a small amount of scan distortion that you can see there. We do see some strange effects, like you see this difference in contrast is because we aren't at a perfect high angle annular dark field imaging mode. It's probably more like annular dark field, and so we see a small amount of diffraction contrast, which shows up effectively. It's showing the strain that is present within that bend. So we often see those sort of features. You also sometimes get effects of a little bit of curtaining on, which is due to the fib milling of the material. So you can see that particularly in regions whereby, if we go later on, we have some of these more complicated microstructures. They have holes in them, and so it's quite hard to mill them perfectly when there are holes in the structure. You get preferential milling into the hole, and so that can sometimes lead to some banding. Some of this features here is due to banding, so some of them can be quite hard to mill really clearly.
Okay, thank you.
I maybe didn't make it very clear that one of the things that we think can facilitate the sonication exfoliation of these systems and mechanical exfoliation is the presence of these effectively channels, these pockets within the deformed microstructures, which can act as stress concentrators. We know that if you have a hole in the material, it can act as a stress concentrator and could help to rip apart, help to separate the the material during the exfoliation, and hence lead to the better efficiency of exfoliation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Right, okay, I have to get going. Right, okay, so the next part of the talk, I want to talk about some air-sensitive crystals. How are we doing for time? Oh dear, okay, we'll have to speed up. Right, okay, so air-sensitive crystals, I should be full disclosure here, all of the materials that I am going to be talking about are made by mechanical exfoliation. Similar work has been done looking at CBD crystals, but all of the experts that I work with mostly use mechanically exfoliated crystals. And the beauty of that, of course, is that we can exfoliate crystals and then you can recombine them to this so-called band structure engineering. So being able to produce perfect crystals, but made from many different materials, as you would imagine in your head or in a computer. We can also make structures which contain these channels. That's the type of join here, whereby introducing etched planes within the structure. And I haven't got time to talk about that, but there's an awful lot of work being done in Manchester by Andre Geim and Radha Boyer about looking at the flow and diffusion through these types of nano-engineered channels. Okay, so the materials, as you probably many of you are more aware than I am, you've made by either dry transfer or wet transfer of mechanically exfoliated flakes, and then these are stacked up on top of each other. So we end up with images, optical images of the systems where we're stacking together. Here you can see graphene, then boron nitride, then here we've got molybdenum disulfide, another layer of boron nitride. Some of these structures can take the people who make them several months of work in the clean room, and it takes us just a few hours to destroy them while trying to image them. So many thanks to all those people who let us loose on their devices. This is just one of the most complicated examples that we've looked at. This was a light-emitting diode structure, just demonstrates this approach. Here we have a top and bottom graphene electrode. I missed the graphene bottom electrode, unfortunately. We have some encapsulated molybdenum disulfide quantum wells. They show up much brighter in our dark field imaging than the boron nitride. And these LEDs work by injecting electrons and holes from the top and bottom graphene electrodes. The electrons and holes recombine in the direct bandgap semiconductors, the molybdenum disulfide wells, and that gives you a LED with a reasonable quantum efficiency up to about 8.5%, which is competitive with a lot of the OLEDs, organic LEDs. Okay. However, how well these work is really, really dependent on the quality of the materials, the quality of the interfaces, and this tunneling distance. And so that's the sort of thing which really you can only investigate using this type of cross-sectional scanning, transmission electron microscopy. Things get even more complicated when you start to want to look at air-sensitive crystals. So an example of that is niobium diselenide, which we worked on a few years ago. But all of the air-sensitive crystals that we've got at the moment have been produced using these type of glove box systems, which you can get commercially from Graphene Industries, I'm sure other companies as well. So within the systems, you do the same dry or wet stamp transfer processing, but you do it within the glove box environment. And if you've got any questions about that, you'll have to ask Astrid Weston, who's online to support that. Brilliant. Okay, so some of the cross sections that we've done are looking at many, many different materials. And again, this is work that Aidan led, but he looked at cross-sections through devices where you had a transition metal chalcogenide monolayer sandwiched between two boron nitride layers. And that is used in not just a light-emitting diode, but also field effect transistors. There were lots of examples of those types of devices in Cedric's beautiful talk and also in Frank's talk a couple of weeks ago. So when we look at these devices, we can see that we've got the transition metal chalcogenide layer, and nearby we've got a hexagonal boron nitride layer. And so what we were investigating within these systems was the distance between the center of the metal chalcogenide and the neighboring hexagonal boron nitride. And I should just highlight that we know that niobium diselenide is highly beam sensitive, highly environmentally sensitive as well as being sensitive. And so that device was prepared in the glove box. And you can see that that interfacial separation matches really well with what's expected for a perfect interface from density functional theory. The molybdenum disulfide encapsulated layer and the tungsten disulfide encapsulated layer, also the distances, the interfaces were perfect. They matched density functional theory. But what you'll see for molybdenum diselenide and tungsten diselenide is that they didn't match. And they didn't match by this slightly unusual amount. So the amount is of the order of 1 or 2 angstroms. And 1 or 2 angstroms additional onto an interface is too small to be a trapped hydrocarbon. Hydrocarbons would give you a separation of a nanometer or so. And so this really does point to there being some sort of very local oxidation or formation of hydroxyl groups replacing selenium or onto selenium at that interface. So the referees actually suggested that we should therefore do tungsten diselenide or molybdenum diselenide in the glove box. And indeed, when you do that same experiment, you see that the interfacial separation, this distance between the chalcogen layer and the nearing hexagonal boron nitride, reduces by an angstrom and ends up being the perfect values expected by density functional theory. And you really can see a difference in the distance that you measure within these images. So if we compare here the interface between bulk tungsten diselenide and the boron nitride and the other way around, we can see that we really are getting a closer fit for the boron nitride, a much better interface. And so now the vast majority of specimens that use molybdenum diselenide or tungsten diselenide are fabricated in the glove box because it gives you a better electronic behavior. Any type of point defects are creating scattering, and those scattering centers will degrade the behavior of the electrons that you're trying to characterize. Right, so more recently we've been looking at gallium selenide and indium selenide. This has been lots of people who have shown some really exciting behavior in these types of post-transition metal chalcogenides. If you look at the structure, you can see here we have 2 layers of metal rather than the single layer that we are used to for the molybdenum disulfide, etc. And this is sandwiched between 2 chalcogen layers. In this case, we're just talking about the selenides in these systems. So they're very exciting because they have single photon emission, broad optical bands, excellent photoresponsivity, etc. Okay, however, these are known to be very air sensitive, and particularly their optical properties degrade quite rapidly in the order of tens of hours. Their behavior is degrading back down to almost nothing. Okay. And so we wanted to try and understand what was happening in these systems. And so we've employed an approach which is used quite widely within our groups, which is to do the exfoliation in a argon glove box and then to trap the crystal between 2 inert or 2 stable 2D materials. Usually that's graphene, it can also be boron nitride. So here we've got this graphene layer which is trapping this transition metal chalcogenide layer. Okay, so we can see now some images. As we expect, we get atomic resolution images of these monolayers, gallium selenide and indium selenide. These materials are still pretty beam sensitive even when they're graphene encapsulated. You don't see the presence of the graphene encapsulation layers because graphene is much lower atomic number compared to both gallium and selenium layers. So we can effectively ignore those in the simulations. We can look at point defects. So what was interesting here was that we could see point defects. There were more point defects, missing atoms at the selenium sites than the metal sites for both indium selenide and gallium selenide. We did see both types of defects, and we saw also individual missing atoms for both selenium and gallium in gallium selenide, but the selenium sites we found all the ones we found were substituted by oxygen. We can see that by comparing simulations for a pristine vacancy of selenium and one that's substituted by oxygen. It's quite surprising, but when we did the same experiment for indium selenide, we find that the selenium vacancies are not occupied by oxygen. And that seemed surprising for what is otherwise an isostructural system, but I guess depends on the electronegativity of the system and the oxygen reactivity. I should say the oxygen is present because it gets trapped as part of the hydrocarbon contamination that is between the 2 graphene layers. Or at least that's our hypothesis. Okay. We can look at the defects moving around. We can see that they heal and form and move very rapidly within the electron microscope. So we can see something about their stability. We can look at them agglomerating. So we see point defects which agglomerate over time. Again, we see big differences for gallium selenide compared to indium selenide. So the gallium selenide is forming these triangular type defects, and the indium selenide is forming line type defects. For people who are familiar with looking at defects in TEM, the gallium selenide is similar to the work that is done on hexagonal boron nitride. This is an example from the Ulsan Korea group, and the indium selenide is kind of akin to what you often see in molybdenum diselenide, and that is akin to this work that I'm demonstrating from Uta Kaiser and Arkady Krashenikov, but there are lots of other examples in the literature of these types of line versus triangular defects. Exactly why those two things are going on is still definitely work for needing further understanding, and is an active area of ongoing research. We see big differences in the stacking. It's quite exciting because you can see static stacking in these types of exfoliated bilayers, which isn't present in the crystals as synthesized. So we see this both in gallium selenide and in iridium selenide. We get this AA type stacking, which isn't energetically favorable if you synthesize it. Other people have seen small patches of differences in stacking, and if it's synthesized by a sort of CVD type approach, then they tend to get abrupt interfaces, whereas what you'll see here is that there's a relatively smooth transition between this 2H stacking at the top and the AA type stacking at the bottom, and that's true in both gallium selenide and in indium selenide, as you can see here. Okay, questions?
Yeah, that's so. Before we answer questions, please, when you ask a question, write like this: question, right? Question, so that we can easily find it in the chat, because there are lots of comments that are not questions. So let's have a go. How do you get them from the glove box to the temp without exposing to air? I think we got the answer to that.
Great. Thank you, Astrid.
Yes, and. So the temp environment doesn't affect it after transferring from glove box to TEM?
I'm going to have an example of that in the next section, so that's a great question.
We wait with that. We wait with that.
So not if you don't damage the graphene. If you keep the graphene intact, then it doesn't have any effect at all. It's completely separated from the vacuum in the same way as it is from the air. But if you damage the graphene, then you can have some effect. So, and I'll give you an example of that next. Do you have the facility to fabricate transistors using 2D materials? Personally, I don't, but Roman Gorbachev and the other guys in the National Graphene Institute, who are just across the road from where I work, they do lots of those types of things. So yes, certainly their groups do, and we collaborate with them doing that. In the slide where you showed ambient stacked tungsten diselenide versus glove box stack versus theory, have you tried? Do you expect it to be the same for molybdenum disulfide as well? Yes, we do expect it. Have we tried it? No. Should we have done? Probably yes. So good idea. Would these additional oxidation projects also be expected on CVD grown films? I would imagine it depends on how they are transferred out of the vacuum environment and the purity of the system which the CVD synthesis is done. The answer is I don't know. We haven't looked. That will be really interesting. Gallium selenide and indium selenide are very planar or buckled structures. We don't see big buckling, so we don't see large changes in defocus, which is how we'd be able to tell that. But again, the answer to that is really we've not looked at the large macroscopic buckling. I would have said that difference in stacking, this is almost certainly a ripple in the same way. So there's going to be some larger outer plane displacement for an incommensurate stacking region. And that's very, very common in all 2D crystals. We haven't verified it, but I would be very surprised if that wasn't the case. The vast majority of 2D crystals, when they're not perfectly stacked, have a slightly larger interlayer spacing. Have you observed chalcogen vacancies in CVD grown TMDs? And have you observed preferential oxidation? So I haven't done a lot of work on CVD grown TMDs. Maybe Thomas can answer that if he's around. Have you worked on CVD grown TMDCs?
Yeah, we worked on them, and it's always a little bit tricky to look at the intrinsic defects versus anything beam created, but to the best of our ability, there are some defects, vacancies in CVD grown samples, but it may depend on what the source is, how many they are, and so on.
There's one question. Which substrates do you use for air-sensitive materials exfoliation?
Astrid?
All right, so Astrid will answer that. And let's take on gallium selenide. Did you see twisted discrete angles?
So I don't think we've seen a systematic twist. You can see these changes of stacking, but they're mostly due to a sort of strain rather than a twist. Am I saying that there is no twist? No. Have we studied twist? No. So there probably is some twist, but we've not looked at it systematically, is the answer. Small local regions.
Thanks for answering so many questions. So let's.
Thank you. Should we finish? Or,
yeah, let's take the last session, the last section.
Okay, great. So very quickly, we'll go through black phosphorus. So black phosphorus here is another situation where we have an air-sensitive sandwich. I mean, the filling of the sandwich is black phosphorus rather than the post-pandistal metal chalcogenide, gallium selenide, indium selenide. So again, we are interested in black phosphorus. Well, lots of people are interested in black phosphorus. It's a very high electron mobility, has a promising band gap, but is very air-sensitive. One of the things that we were particularly interested when we were looking at this paper was trying to get nano-confined geometry, so being able to pattern quantum dots right down at the really nanometer scale limits. So we were looking at trying to pattern and see what could be done in the electron microscope, and various other groups have shown that you can pattern with the electron beam. But typically this is done on suspended crystals just as they are, and with an air-sensitive system, if you take that out of the electron microscope, that's no longer going to be usable because it will degrade immediately. So here we were looking at trying to do this patterning in the electron microscope of sandwich type crystal structures. So we've got this black phosphorus filling inside a graphene or a hexagonal boron nitride sandwich. And we can use the high energy electron probe. So we have played around lots with the energy versus the dwell time in order to work out what the best precision or the best patterning parameters are. And we can see that as we increase the electron dose, we are clearly able to cut through all three layers, graphene, the black phosphorus, and the bottom graphene again. Now, what's interesting is when you take this out of the electron microscope, if you take this structure out of the electron microscope and then put it back in again, we see no etching at all in these low dose type cuts. But up at the thicker or the higher dose cuts, we see that these regions have enlarged, but they've only enlarged by a few nanometers. And that enlargement of a few nanometers is stable once you've taken it out of the microscope for several months. I think the longest we looked at was a specimen that had been out of the microscope for 9 months. And it still had this characteristic width. The whole crystal hadn't degraded. There's a certain amount of contamination, species oxidation that's escaped from this crack. But the original line that we have able to be drawn has increased by a few nanometers in both directions compared to what was perfectly cut within the TEM. So we wanted to understand what was causing this, I guess, this termination of this, the degradation. And we then did some elemental mapping. This is EEL's elemental mapping, which Nick Clark did. And you can see here that we've got the carbon intensity. So you can see a reduction in carbon intensity where you've cut through the 2 graphene layers. You can see that the phosphorus signal has reduced for this thickness of the order of a few nanometers. But you can see around the edge of the phosphorus, we have this phosphoric acid component. And so in order to extract this, Nick looked at both the signal that corresponds to the crystalline black phosphorus and also this phosphorus oxide type component, was able to extract the two and see that we've got this continuous layer of phosphoric acid, which is effectively protecting further degradation and preventing the material from the crack from enlarging further or the pattern from changing. So it's great to do that in an electron microscope. It's not a terribly scalable technique, and so we decided to take the protocols that we developed and try to apply them into an E-beam lithography system. So this is a black phosphorus hall bar that was taken in the scanning electron microscope E-beam lithography system. And here we've used 100 keV E-beam to be able to pattern cuts in the hall bar. And because we've got a full device, we were able to measure the mobility across these different areas. And it was really exciting that we found that when you did these cuts, the cuts were still really on the order of a few nanometers thick, but they were fully insulating. So that's really promising in terms of using this type of approach to be able to create very, very small features, much higher spatial resolution than you could achieve using conventional resist type processing with the electron beam lithography. Okay. Is it possible to look at the cross-section of the cut? Yeah, I guess you could have a go. That's a good idea. We haven't done it, but that would probably be worth a try. Fantastic. Okay. So the spot size of that TEM we've talked about before was of the order of sub-angstrom, so 80 picometers I think is normal. Here, in order to be able to have enough electrons to really be damaging the specimen to drill through the sample, we were compromising that, and so the spot size we were putting up, we were having typically a couple of nanoamps of current in the probe, and that gives us a spot size of more like 1 nanometer. Maybe 0.5 nanometers. So much, much worse than you'd expect when you were doing really high resolution imaging. But again, that's necessary to get enough electrons to damage the sample in a realistic time. If you don't have enough current in your electron probe, then you build up carbon instead of damaging the structure. So in order to do the patterning and the drilling, we had to just non-optimize the parameters. Okay, great. Right, last bit. Okay, so I don't need to go into a lot of details of this. There was a beautiful talk by Frank about twisted bilayer graphene and graphene boron nitride structures. Important things that people who aren't familiar with these types of systems is that you get this type of beautiful features when you have a small twist angle. So here we've got a twist angle between two layers of graphene of 0.1 degree. And below about 1 degree, I think, you start to get these domain structures. So what you are seeing here is sort of shown on these images A and B, and I should say this is not my work, this is a paper from Nature Materials in 2019. There's been some beautiful work on similar structures by Benjamin Butz and various other groups who've done some brilliant electron microscopy on various systems like this. But just to highlight what they've done in graphene is that these domains correspond to regions of perfect stacking, be it either A, B, or BA. These are two different colored domains, and you can image those using dark field TEM, which is illustrated in various other papers. And between those A, B, and BA domains, we have these incommensurate regions which are related to small areas of misorientation, but also have a slight ripple component to them. They're slightly different out of plane separation. Okay. However, in about a year ago, there was an issue of Nature which came out, which had 4 papers, all considering the different exciting electronic and photonic behaviors that you could get when you had twisted transition metal chalcogenide bilayers. And they have a slightly different behavior compared to graphene. So we were really interested to understand about the reconstruction behavior that might happen in these systems, because none of those early papers considered the fact that these transition metal chalcogenide might also reconstruct. What we mean by reconstruct is to preferentially form regions of perfect stacking separated by incommensurate boundaries. So this is the model that I've taken for transition metal chalcogenide, and we're going to put on top another perfect layer of transition metal chalcogenide with exactly the same orientation, except it is twisted by a few degrees. Okay, and that's what's shown here. And if we have a look at this picture, we can label different types of stacking within this material. And so that's important for the next part, so I just want to highlight that here. We can see there are regions when the chalcogen X is on top of the chalcogen in the next layer. There are regions where the chalcogen is on top of the metal in the next layer, and vice versa. There's regions where the metal on the bottom is on top of the chalcogen on the top. Okay, so these regions where there's a metal on top of a chalcogen are a common stacking sequence, which is 3R, so that's well known in lots of materials, although in molybdenum disulfide that's not the most stable stacking, but that is a well-known 3R stacking in lots of different 2D systems. Okay. So we had a look and did some dark field imaging, and again, this is medium angular dark field. We can see these triangular domain structures, which are similar to the types of structures that you see in the graphene materials. So we can label these different regions. We can now zoom in. This is a high angular dark field image of the same system, and we can see that we have regions where the metal is on top of the chalcogen and regions where the chalcogen is on top of the metal. Now these are both 3R type stacking, and if we look at the density functional theory, which can predict the favorable energy, the energy of these systems, we can see that the 3R type stacking is the most favorable, and both of these XM and MX type structures have the same energy. Less favorable, again, are the XX regions, so these are these little points here, and the boundary regions have some energy in between. Now, these different energy structures also have a difference in interplanar spacing, and that's what's highlighted in this inset here. Okay, fantastic. So we get these triangular domains forming because of these both MX and XM domains having stable energy. But unlike in graphene, we can also get an anti-parallel type of twist microstructure. So that is how we form the standard 2H stacking behavior of a transition metal chalcogenide. So if you take your perfect monolayer and you twist the next layer by 180 degrees and then put the two on top of each other and they're perfectly aligned, then that will give you the 2H stacking. If they have a small misalignment, then that will give you an anti-parallel twisted bilayer. So that's what we're talking about here. And now again, we can label the different regions. We have 2H regions, and we have regions which have chalcogen on chalcogen and metal on metal. So let's zoom in and have a look at that. And immediately we can see that the domain structures we get in these 2H or anti-parallel aligned structures are completely different to anything that's previously been seen in either hexagonal boron nitride graphene or graphene twisted bilayers. And that is because the relative energy of these two different types of domains is very different. The 2H structure we know is incredibly stable. That is the structure that forms naturally in these crystals. But this structure is less energetically favorable. And so we find that these domains are smaller compared to the 2H domains that we have here. And this is the high resolution image where we've just sort of highlighted the regions of these different stacking. So if we look now at how these domains evolve as a function of twist angle, as the twist angles get smaller, the same as in graphene, the domain sizes will get larger because you're getting closer and closer to this perfect 2H stacking. So if you have a twist angle in anti-parallel alignment of just a bit more than 2 degrees, we don't see any real large amount of reconstruction at all, although we do see these isolated points of and 2H stacking. As we start to get down below 2 degrees, we can see the different sizes of the domains. And as we start to get below 1 degree, see at 0.8 and here in 0.7, we can see that these 2H domains become much, much larger. And in fact, we see that the domains seem to have a maximum size of about 5 or 10 nanometers, whereas the 2H domains can go up to several micrometers. So, just to prove to you that we've really done this, you can have a look at the beautiful relaxed structures that are simulated from the density functional theory group from Professor Bologna Falco's group, and also the unrelaxed structure, and you can clearly compare the simulated STEM images with the experimental data. If we zoom in, we can do the overlay, and we can see that the overlay of the HADEF, which is here not coloured but in white, and then the positions of the two layers are shown in red and blue respectively. And we get a reasonably good fit for these structures. However, this is only showing you the lateral position. It's not showing you any sort of out of plane displacement. And so in order to investigate the out of plane displacement, then Astrid Weston, who's the first author on this paper, went and did some atomic force microscopy, first of all in contact mode. Here you're looking at the lateral and the height displacements, and you can see these domains. So now we've gone back to parallel stacking, so all the domains are fairly triangular. And this shows you that we can see the domains, but really this type of differences in the expected interplanar spacings for these crystals are really on the limit of what is possible with AFM in this imaging mode. And so instead that she went and did some work looking at conductive AFM, and the conductive AFM really beautifully revealed the different domain structures that you get in this parallel aligned material. And the reasons why you get these two different types of domains is maybe not completely straightforward. It's due to a sort of layer polarized wave function, which arises due to the fact that you don't have a center of inversion symmetry within the 3R stacking. So these are both 3R stacking, but it's 3R stacking looked at from one direction and then turned upside down and looked from the other direction. And that causes a polarization of the wave function, which means that it's easier to tunnel into the X dash than it is into the XM dash type region. In fact, as you can see here, or in this M dash X, Astrid, it's 1.7 times approximately easier to tunnel into these darker, the lighter domains than it is into the darker ones. And you see the same thing is shown here on the right for tungsten bisulfide. Now, that's for parallel. You can also have a quick look just in the last minute or so for the conductive AFM on the anti-parallel stacking. Remember, that's when we have this, these larger 2H domains separated by smaller stacked domains. And if you look at the band structure for this system, it's quite surprising. Actually, the band structure seems very, very similar for 2H compared to M'. And yet you're clearly seeing this domain structure inside the conductive AFM. So it's quite hard to explain the tunneling difference. And we can't use the same wave function polarization argument because the 2H structure has this perfect inversion symmetry, so we wouldn't expect the same type of behavior. And so instead, Professor Falco and his team went back and had a look at the effect of the piezoelectric charge distribution, which is induced due to variations in strain caused by differences in stacking. And when they plotted this charge distribution, they found that there were going to be pockets of positive charge. And these pockets of positive charge are at the sites. And having a pocket of positive charge means that it's easier to tunnel into that region. So the local charge measurement, which is done by conductive AFM, is easier at these points of stacking. Interestingly, as you start to get to very small twist angles, where, as I said, the 2H type of domains start to merge along domain boundaries, you also see a slight enhancement in their positive charge at this boundary. And again, that's visible inside the conductive AFM measurements, which is just shown on the right here, shown here. Although it's a much smaller order of magnitude. Now, this piezoelectric charge distribution is much stronger that we see it for the anti-parallel. It's much weaker in the parallel type alignment with the triangular domains. And that's because in that type of system, the piezo-induced charge is opposite in the two monolayers, and so it will cancel itself out. So, in conclusion, I hope that I have convinced you that transitional electron microscopy is a really key technique to be able to probe some information, structural and chemical, about a whole range of different two-dimensional heterostructures. In some cases, it's the only technique that can provide us this useful information for various different sandwich structures, lots of complex heterostructures, and now for twisted TMD bilayers in conjunction with various other imaging techniques, AFM, RPES, etc. I'd like to thank all of the people that worked so incredibly hard to get all this data. David Hopperton, Aiden Rudy, Yi Chao Zhu, Nick Clark, Dan Kelly, Simon Fairclough, all the people from my group, Astrid Weston particularly, and Matt Hamer from Alex Summerfield, all of these people, Dan Telly, and who are in Roman Gorbachev's group, the theory guys who have been fantastic in Professor Falco's group, the other guys that we work with for theory support. This is my group and the smallest and least productive member, and all of the funders who are very, very supportive. And of course, thank you very much indeed for still being present, at least some of you, towards the end of this chat. And thank you very much indeed.